Nowadays, everything in industry and government is pretty complicated. You can't run your business making decisions by trial and error. All you will get is trial and catastrophe. In operational research, we work out on paper first what the results of different decisions would be, so we really know what's the best thing to do before we have to do it. Actually, operational research was born at a time when it was vital to do this, where a wrong decision could be a matter of life and death. It started as a scientific study of military operations, and its aim was to find ways of helping the armed forces to achieve their targets more effectively. Since then, its scientific approach has been used to the same end on all kinds of peacetime operations, from refuse collection to big business. So, in operational research, or OR as we call it, we take complex management problems and try to solve them by scientific observation and analysis. I'm always fascinated by the way the surface flesh of complexity disappears, and behind it appears a simple structure, a skeleton of cause and effect. Complexity is only skin deep, and there are only 8 types of structure at the heart of all the problems of industry or government. In this program, we're going to look at several different problems, all having the same basic structure. We've seen part of the first problem, the waiting ships. Let's take a further look. Port Talbot is a tidal port, and the ships are waiting for high tide because this is the only time when they can come in. Actually, at some high tides, not all the bigger ships can come in because the entrance channel to the port isn't deep enough. If it is a high enough tide, as soon as it's fully up, 1 or 2 of the ships in the queue can come up the entrance channel into the port. There isn't enough time for any more to come through before the tide has turned. After coming up the channel, every ship has to pass through a lock. In many cases, it's only just big enough to hold her. In fact, it's a ticklish job to get one of the big ships through. The size of the lock limits the size of ore-carrying ships coming into Port Talbot to 10,000 tons. This means the port can't take the large modern ore carriers, which can carry up to 45,000 tons or more. Once a ship is through the lock and into the port, she may be able to go straight into one of the berths to unload. But often both berths are occupied unloading earlier ships, so she has to wait until a berth is free. Once into a berth, she'll be unloaded in about 12 hours. So an ore carrier coming into Port Talbot docks might have to wait several days. Port Talbot isn't unique in causing shipping delays. If other ports don't have such complex tidal problems, most do have the normal queuing problems caused by more ships arriving to unload than there are berths to take them. All these situations have the same structure: in, service, out. In all we've just seen, the problems are caused by queues, ships, men, materials lying idle, losing time and often money. But you don't always have long queues at service points. Sometimes the service facilities are too lavish for the demand there to meet. So although you have short queues, the cost of doing this is too high. Ray Jackson, after analyzing the problem in his doctor's surgery, produced what he called a model of the situation. This model contains the essential features of the problem and enables us to compare the results of taking different decisions so that we can choose the right one. Whenever we have a problem in OR, we build a model of it, as indeed other scientists do. Suppose you're the managing director of a company and you're worried about where to locate a factory. Here's a physical model which will help you solve the problem. Now, you know that this factory is going to have to send 10 lorry loads of material a week to Newcastle, 20 to Bristol, 40 to Manchester, and 40 to London. Where should you put your factory so that your transport costs are going to be as small as possible? This ring here stands for the factory, and it is pulled towards Newcastle by the 10 lorry loads which have to go there every week, and we have a weight of 10 units pulling it towards Newcastle. Similarly, we have a weight of 20 units pulling this towards Bristol, a weight of 40 units pulling it towards Manchester, and another weight of 40 units pulling it towards London. Now, when I release this ring here, you'll see that these forces operating against each other achieve a point of balance here at Coventry. And this is the cheapest place to put your factory. But if it's right in the nave of Coventry Cathedral, clearly you'll have to take another decision. Also, you may want the factory to be at Stratford-on-Avon, because this is a more pleasant place to live. And if I hold this ring at Stratford and measure the force pulling it towards Coventry, this force is a measure of the extra transport cost of building in Stratford. A physical model like this would only cope with very simple problems. Real-life problems are too complicated. Here's Shell, Mex and BP's distribution network for fuel oils. Fuel oils are transported from their depots all around the country by road, rail and pipeline. Now, to cope with a complicated system like this, the OR scientist uses a mathematical model. Here's the mathematical version of the simple physical model we've just looked at, a couple of simple equations. And you can extend this to cope with the large number of factors that you get with real-life distribution problems. You just have more equations. You can change your transport, your demand, the number of factories or the number of refineries by changing the equations. Such a mathematical model is a useful way of describing a real-life problem and of experimenting with ways of solving it. It saves having to experiment with the real thing. Ray Jackson's doctor could have found the best appointment system by trying out a different one every week, but this would have taken months and can be done in 5 minutes with the model Ray Jackson devised. Now, there was another very important thing that Jackson's model did, and this was to reconcile the doctor's point of view with the patient, so that both of them wasted as little time as possible. If applied on a national scale, the savings in time would be enormous, because at the moment in Great Britain we lose over 5 million man-days in doctors' waiting rooms each year, compared with only 4 million in strikes. This is a problem in all organizations, particularly large ones, where different groups of people who are supposed to be working together to the same end work to their own separate, often conflicting ends. By analyzing the situation and building a model, the OR worker can see how to redirect these conflicting aims so that the organization can work more efficiently. This compromise between different objectives is at the heart of every queuing problem, for the person who provides the service is different from the one who is served, which is what you've got in the importing of iron ore, where the ship owners control arrivals and the port authorities or the steel companies run the unloading. David Owen and Roger Edison built a queuing model of this situation to balance the interests of these two groups of people, to make the total cost of importing iron ore as cheap as possible. We are used these days to worrying about productivity. But if we tried to increase the efficiency of the importing operation by increasing the productivity of the unloading berth by making it work full time, it would lead to a grossly uneconomic situation overall. As you can see, if we worked the port so that it was 90% of the year occupied by ships, that is 10% idle, the cost of importing a ton of ore would be many times as expensive as it need be, because of the increased queuing delays. Next week we shall look at how operational research has tackled problems with a different structure, problems involved in outfitting a ship, scheduling production in a steelworks, and organizing an efficient army, to provide the people controlling these operations with a firmer basis for decision. The man who organized the great train robbery must have had problems. A lot of different jobs to coordinate before, during and after the robbery. He had the problem of working out what men, vehicles, money and equipment he'd need, and how he should best deploy them. Also, he had to work to very accurate deadlines. So although this robbery was a lawless enterprise, to the man who organized it, it must have presented many of the same kinds of problems that men organizing any complex, law-abiding operation have to face. And Albert Battersby, an OR scientist, has used it for fun to illustrate an OR technique called critical path scheduling, which makes the planning of such complex operations more efficient. In fact, here's the logical scheme he worked out of all the activities in such a large-scale robbery. But joking apart, whatever the operation, it's from a logical diagram of all the activities involved in it that critical path scheduling works out the most efficient way of organizing it, so that it can be finished in the shortest possible time and with the most economical use of resources. And in fact, the technique is being used in all branches of industry, with great savings in time and money, but particularly in the construction industries, building and shipbuilding, which we shall be looking at in a moment. We shall also in this program look at the quite different problems involved in steel making and in the army, which OR has to tackle in a rather special way. But first we'll look at the use of critical path scheduling in more detail. This diagram shows all the jobs that have to be done to build a large factory. Each arrow represents a specific job, as in the train robbery plan, and the diagram shows how all the jobs are related to each other and which jobs have to be completed before another can begin. For example, you can't start your floor finish operation until you have completed these jobs, which are all concerned with the roof. So this network diagram shows the essential structure of the operation, and it's from this, as we said earlier, that we can use critical path scheduling, or CPS, to build up a logical and efficient planning system. The name of the method describes very accurately what it does. First of all, the time that each job takes has to be worked out, taking account of all the resources available to do it. Then, out of the maze of different jobs, the method works out that particular sequence of jobs which are critical to the whole job being completed in minimum time. A delay in any of these means that the whole operation will be delayed. The basic principle of the method is very simple. If two jobs can be done simultaneously, then the whole task will be finished quicker in the long run than if you do the two jobs one after the other. Though such construction jobs appear complicated, they have a pretty simple basic structure. Most scheduling problems in industry aren't so basically simple, and they have to be solved differently. Organizing efficient production, whether in an engineering works, steel works, or wherever, is a difficult job. Here's a diagram which shows the flow of materials through a typical production process. Actually, it's for the production of tinned food. This looks just like the arrow diagrams we've seen, but it couldn't be more different. In the critical path diagram, each junction between the arrows represented an event, the finishing of one job and the beginning of the next, nothing more. However, here, each junction is a service point, man or machine, and along each of these arrows flow men and materials coming up to each junction for a service. As we saw in the last program, it's the variability in this rate of flow and in the rate of service that causes all the problems. Just one queue is difficult enough, and this is a complex network of interacting queues. Though the single queue is difficult enough to cope with in practice, we can at least formulate it mathematically from first principles, and we can work out a model to tell us the best course of action to solve our problems. We can't do this yet for a complicated network of queues like this. But the OR scientist can solve such problems by experiment. He can't experiment on the factory floor. You just can't run a large company by trial and error. So how does he do it? He does it by using a simulation of the real-life situation. Suppose I want to work out the probability that if I stand on Eros in Piccadilly Circus, close my eyes, and walk across the Haymarket, that I'll get killed. I could measure the speed of all the vehicles, the width of the road, and so on, and try to work out the chance mathematically. If I succeeded, I'd have made the kind of model I've been talking about in these programs. But I doubt whether I could do it, because of the complicated way the movements of the individual cars interact with each other. On the other hand, I could try an experiment, a real experiment. I could get hundreds of people to shut their eyes and walk across the road. I could count how many get killed, and this would tell me the chances that I want to know. But this is an expensive way of finding the answer. I could make a physical model of Piccadilly Circus and get toy cars to move around it in a real-life way. I could then move a toy man across the road and see how often he gets hit. This would be a physical simulation of the situation. But we needn't use model cars at all. We could do a mathematical simulation. We could represent the movements of the individual cars, which we'd get from observation at Piccadilly Circus, and the movement of the man mathematically in a computer. We could then, inside the computer, play the man against the traffic to see what proportion of times he'd get hit. We could experiment by varying the speed of the cars or the speed of walking to see how these affected how often he got hit. This is very like the experiments of the physical scientist. Playing a situation through like this is the only way of solving some of the more complicated problems of OR. Dr. Tocker of United Steel has used simulation to help make the complex business of steel making more economic.
I've actually looked at a whole range of problems, but I only talk about one of these now. The steel being made in this furnace will soon be ready, and it's now that the decision must be made to determine exactly what kind of steel it's to be.
Sequence 21.
Right, make sequence 21, 30-35 carbon.
Such decisions are difficult to make. They have to be made at about 50 a day, and there's a high cost in time and money for each wrong decision made. We've been using OR to improve their success. The decisions are in fact concerned with one particular part of the steelmaking process. In the melting shop, steel is made by refining molten iron, or by melting scrap and refining this. To start with, the raw material is charged to a furnace. Other materials are also added with a ground charger, some to refine the steel and some to fix its quality. After a period ranging from 3 to 8 hours, the steel is made, and then it's poured or tapped into a giant ladle held by another crane and carried across the shop to be poured, or as we say, teamed, into moulds mounted on a railway bogie. After standing a little to become solid on the outside, they're hauled to yet another crane to have the mould stripped off, leaving our first product, ingots. We had to devise a control system to make better decisions, and we decided to experiment with a model of the plant. Experiments on the real plant might have led to disastrous loss of production. To build this model or simulation, we had to time each stage in the process large numbers of times, and in many cases we had to use special apparatus. For example, to time cranes in the soaking pit area, an observer signalled the starting and finishing of the ingot lifts by pressing buttons on a console. These signals were fed to a recording apparatus which produced a tape record. The tape records for the whole of the process were fed into a computer which analysed the data. This data, together with studies of how the plant was organised, were built into a mathematical description of the way the plant worked. Actually, we had to invent a whole new language to build this description. We made it into a computer program, and when this was run on the computer, it imitated exactly the real plant. To see whether our model was valid, we invited a group of managers experienced in the real plant to try scheduling a normal batch of orders through our simulated plant. In fact, we still use the game to train new managers. We arrange for messages from the computer model to come out on teleprinters. These give us up-to-date information about the state of the plant.
But simulation isn't only used to solve the complex problems of industry. It's used in the Army, at the Army Operational Research Establishment. Here they use the war game as a means of research to find the best ways of making our army as effective as possible. In fact, the game provides a means of learning in peacetime what could otherwise be only learnt in war. Ronald Shepherd is responsible for the research.
The difference between the simulation of steel making and our game is that we have, in our game, two sides competing with each other. The essence of this war game is to simulate this conflict in as much detail as possible. Each commander has all his own forces on his model. Together with those of the enemy, he has been able to gather from intelligence, which is in fact the only way he gets information about the enemy. This is obviously exactly the position a commander is in a real-life battle. The room I'm standing in is called the control room. All the orders from orange and purple commanders for the movement of their forces are relayed to the control room and are transferred onto the control model. Here in control, the model of the battlefield has both orange and purple forces on it. Here and here, these are the ones with the triangular hats. But the outcome of many actions in battle is not so clear-cut, and they are subject to the laws of chance. In fact, Orange Commander has just decided he wants more detailed information about the defended minefield. And he sent a message to Control to say that he's sending up a helicopter to find out. Obviously, he'll only get useful information back if the plane isn't shot down, if there's adequate visibility, and so on. To decide what happens in such a situation, Control Room uses laws of chance. These rules give the odds of such a helicopter recce coming off in this situation. To find out what the result is on this particular occasion, the controllers use a random number machine. You can see the random numbers coming up on it up there. They operate it by pressing a button on the table. This device is really rather like an electronic roulette wheel. The result that comes up is given to the commander as an outcome of his actions.
The orange helicopter's been shot down.
Thank you. Hello, Orange. Your reconnaissance helicopter flying to Delta 1319 has failed to report and must be presumed lost.
Are you ready for my 1100-hour orders?
Yes, go ahead.
I intend to launch a minefield breaching operation in Delta 1319 at 1300 hours. In support of this, I will put in a helicopter-borne company in the wooded area in Delta 1315. Their task on landing will be to establish an offensive base and divert the enemy attention from my main attack here.
Let us move forward in time to 1400 hours and hear the Purple Commander receiving intelligence about the action in Delta 1319.
Purple. Intelligence for 1400 hours. In Delta 1315, your 1 Alpha Bravo reconnaissance troop reports a helicopter force, estimated at company strength, landed in the wooded area east of his position. He is now engaging.
And so the game will proceed, cycle by cycle, for as long as we need. We take very full records as we play so that we can analyze the progress of the game carefully afterwards, and also so that we can compare the results of other games in a series.
In this program, we've taken problems of complexity, problems where hundreds of factors act and react in chance ways. Mathematical analysis breaks down on many of these, but we've seen it's possible to get guidelines for decision by playing the problem through on an experimental model. Now, as you saw, at the critical topmost level of the war game, they were unable to get any mechanical or electronic substitute for an army commander because they couldn't forecast how one would act in a given situation. So they had to use a real live commander. But in most OR problems where the human factor enters, we can study the people concerned as part of a group, and we can find patterns of behavior of groups of people and see how these affect the working of the organization. Next week we shall be looking at this in coal mining and in hospitals. So operational research can tackle manpower problems, and it's these that we shall be looking at in the first half of today's program. We shall then go on to look at the future of operational research in industry and in government, and finish with a discussion of the practical problems of using operational research. Now, in all management problems, there are 4 balls to juggle with, 4 factors, called the 4 M's, which interact with each other to determine the success or failure of an operation. To solve the kinds of problem we've shown operational research tackling so far in these programs, we saw that the OR man needed to concentrate his studies on only 3 of these: the machines, materials, and money, because they were the dominant factors in the situation under study. And as we saw, their interactions were complicated enough. The 4th M we've so far skated around, and that's the men running the organization. This is the most difficult factor of the 4 to study and to change if there's anything wrong. And by men here, I mean everyone on the payroll, from those on the shop floor to the man at the top. Obviously, the way the organization of the men and their behavior interacts with the machines, materials, and money must affect the overall efficiency of an operation. And where the human factor is the dominating cause of a problem, OR must tackle it directly. Several OR studies have done just this. In doing so, of course, it overlaps with social science. The only clear distinction between them is that OR always makes its studies to solve problems. It's a practical action science. Social science turns out to be quite frequently, but this is usually incidental to the main aim, which is an academic understanding of human nature. We're now going to look at a couple of OR studies where the central problems were human ones. The first concerns miners, the second nurses.
The supply of recruits, which is along here, goes down as the distance of the men's home from the pit increases. But travelling distance to the pit was only one factor affecting the problem. To predict how many men we can recruit and how many we'd lose at a given pit, we had to find the other major factors involved. One of these turned out to be the length of service. There's a peak in the number of men we lose after about 2 years' service. When it gets down as far as 4 years' service, most men stay fairly well. We don't lose many. Knowing that travelling distance and length of service are the major factors affecting this problem, manpower planning at the NCB has been much easier. First, we know that a colliery which is expanding must expect its labour turnover to shoot up from the first few years, and we must budget for this by over-recruiting. We also know, as Lord Roban said earlier, that if we have to close down a colliery somewhere, how many men will flow to other pits in the vicinity and how many will be left redundant. We will therefore be able to do all that's possible to re-employ these men by perhaps helping them move to a new area nearer to other pits.
Dr. Holden has described a study where external factors in employment, such as travelling time to work, were most important. And he was able to find how these factors affected manpower problems by purely objective means. He didn't need to ask anyone their attitudes about anything. Now, Professor Revens at Manchester University has been looking at hospital staff problems, and he finds that what affects this is something purely internal to the hospital. And to find the key to the problem, he had to measure attitudes.
We've been looking at how the morale of the staff in a hospital influences its effectiveness. By a hospital's effectiveness, I mean its ability to treat patients quickly and efficiently. And this, believe it or not, does vary considerably from hospital to hospital. As a result of this study, I'm sure that if the morale in many hospitals were improved, we could reduce the many hospital waiting lists and use the precious time of our nurses more effectively.
The results which emerged surprised many sisters. For example, in one hospital, most of the ward sisters only spent 1% of their time formally instructing their student nurses, but between 24 and 60% of their time on administrative work. This doesn't say much for the way student nurses get advice and training on these wards, although there was, of course, opportunity for the student nurses to talk to other members of the ward team.
Having observed the kind of jobs different grades of nursing staff do, we then wanted to know what they felt about nursing. What were their attitudes towards their work and the physical and psychological conditions which affected its performance? First of all, we carried out a general attitude survey in a number of hospitals. This involved informal, undirected interviews with all kinds of people, including doctors, matrons, sisters, nurses, cleaners, and administrative staff. The object of these interviews was to get an overall picture of the kind of feelings and attitudes that existed among hospital staff. In every hospital, the people talked a lot about human relationships, the way they got on with the other staff. In some hospitals, most of the comment was pretty favourable. From the whole battery of comments collected in this general survey, it was clear that the ward sister occupied a focal position in the hospital. She was in charge of all staff in the ward, and she was the one through whom all other hospital staff should work. It was also clear that her attitudes to other staff in the hospital, both to her superiors and to those nurses in her charge, gave an idea of the attitudes pervading the hospital. If the ward sister was disgruntled about lack of cooperation from senior colleagues and service departments, this was likely to be reflected in her behaviour towards her own ward staff. So, to determine this more clearly, Professor Evans devised an attitude questionnaire which was given to 30 sets of ward sisters. The questionnaire consisted of a whole lot of statements which the sisters were asked to agree or disagree with. It was designed to find out what their attitudes were towards certain aspects of their working situation. They were basically of two kinds: attitudes towards superiors and those towards their subordinates.
From their responses, we devised scales for comparing the feelings of different ward sisters towards staff relations. The ward sisters in some hospitals felt that the relations were good all round. We might call these the high morale hospitals. The sisters here had faith in their superiors and were considerate to their subordinates. In other hospitals, those of low morale, the ward sisters often felt resentment towards their superiors and were unsympathetic to subordinates. Do these attitudes provide the key to our earlier results for staff wastage and for length of patient stay? From a complex statistical analysis of all three factors in 15 hospitals, we found that they do. This is the pattern that emerged. Hospitals ranked first for low staff wastage and short patient stays, like A here, had the best staff relations as indicated by their ward sisters' attitudes. And so on for the other hospitals. Hospitals like E, worst for staff wastage and patient stay, had the poorest staff relations. All this makes sense. It boils down to communication. In the high morale hospitals, satisfactory staff attitudes allow completely free exchange of information between all levels of staff.
So far in these programs, we have seen some of the past work of OR. But what about its use in the future? There's one important problem area in industry which has, until recently, been untouched by OR, and that's marketing. The effect on sales of price discounts, promotional offers, the amount of advertising is largely unknown. And this makes it an attractive area for OR because it introduces measurement into a situation for the first time. And it is, in fact, beginning to make some contribution to marketing problems. But the area where OR will probably make its greatest contribution in the future is government. Stafford Beer, an operational research consultant with considerable experience of OR, has made a special study of this both in Britain and abroad.
Although the originators of OR were British scientists, and although the development of OR applications in the military field, in business and in industry is as far advanced in Britain as anywhere else in the world, there is a strange void when it comes to government. As you know, OR is concerned with the scientific appraisal of policies, with the quantification of problems involving value judgments, with the valuation of alternative courses of action, in a word, with decision. There could, by definition, be no more important, no more relevant use of OR than in the policy-making and decision-taking processes of civil government. Moreover, one finds in this arena that indicator of large success, of big payoff, the very large, very complex system. OR is at its best and most useful in dealing with situations too involved to fit into the head. It fits them into computers instead.
Any government which tries to act without precise knowledge is driving in a fog. In India, the problem of measurement is rather easier than in England. We live in an economy which has evolved to such a degree of complexity that the results of an action in any one sector have complicated and far-reaching repercussions in many others. Furthermore, in India, where most of the people are short of the bare necessities of life, it's easier to see what are the prime national objectives. Much easier than it is in this country, where the objectives are concerned more with the division of affluence.
In this series, we have looked at some of the past successes of OR and what its future potential might be. But it's not all plain sailing. As a science, we can only proceed step by step on the basis of what we can demonstrate. And in many problem areas, OR has so far failed. OR is not the panacea for all management problems. Indeed, many managers in industry and government are skeptical of the value of OR. They don't see its future quite so bright. But all this is to the good because it's out of the clash of opposing views of OR practitioner and management skeptic that a better appreciation and understanding of the strength and weakness of OR will emerge. So because OR is an applied science, we have two kinds of problem. Intellectual ones arising from the difficulty of the science itself, and practical ones arising from working with people in their organizations. But we've been encouraged by our progress so far. By applying scientific methods and mathematical techniques, we have been able to cope with the many factors and the chance and uncertainty involved in many management decisions. It is perhaps in our measurement of things that have never been measured before that our greatest contribution lies. It is here we are pioneering, and here that, as OR men, the greatest excitement of our job lies. We hope that as our research continues, our help to management will expand, not only at the executive level, but more importantly at the policy-making level as well, so that managers at all levels have a firmer basis for decisions on industry and government.